3 weeks into mass political protests, Algeria's President Abdelaziz Bouteflika has given in, withdrawing his bid for a 5th term in office. The announcement did not come from Bouteflika himself. The 82-year-old has hardly been seen in public since a stroke 6 years ago left him paralyzed. For now, Algeria's invisible ruler remains in office. His indefinite postponement of next month's election suggests he might not be going anytime soon. Algeria's social media space has been occupied by protesters, driving the street movement, providing their own coverage of it. Citizens have learned not to count on media aligned with the government, especially broadcasters. They've long been controlled by the state. Criticism of the ailing ruler had been scarce there. However, things are changing. Marginalized voices, many of them banned from the airwaves, are being heard once again. Reporters at state-backed outlets have been criticizing the journalism of their own channels. Could this really be the beginning of the end for a president who's been in power for nearly 20 years? Our starting point this week is Algiers. Sunday, March 4th, the evening newscast on Canal Algerie, a French-language channel that stayed on. For the Algerian media, it would be a telling moment. For the woman who had spent 15 years in the anchor chair, the last straw. Nadia Madassi reads a letter from President Bouteflika, word for word, addressing the unrest on the streets. Then she turned to news of an opposition figure, a voice of dissent, announcing his intention to run for Bouteflika's job.
She was reading, going through her newscast, and was going to read an item about one of the other candidates, and she was clearly told on her earpiece, don't read that.
Candidat indépendant.
Like practices straight out of the Soviet Union.
Looking at her body language, she was really in a very weird position, and she expressed that so much. And just after the TV show, she resigned from that position and said, enough is enough.
It was another reminder that you don't live in a free country. You are under the thumb of a regime that controls what your visual cortex sees. And that is an outrageous thing for someone to feel in the 21st century, in the borderless world of the internet, where ideas are moving across.
The demonstrations began a month ago in northern Algeria, far from the capital. They were set off by the news that President Bouteflika would seek an unprecedented and unconstitutional 5th term in office. Within a week, the protests had reached Algiers. Organized on and driven by social media, the unrest quickly grew to a level the country has not seen in decades. Initially, the state-owned channels Canal Algerie and ENTV both buried their heads in the sand, ignoring the story. However, 4 days into the protests in the capital, on February 26th, journalists held one of their own over the orders that they were getting from above, preventing them from doing their job.
That was a pretty significant moment in that journalists were basically saying this is not acceptable, and were able to act on that. Whereas previously, you know, that step maybe wouldn't have been taken. And the extent to which civil society really was mobilizing in support of the movement kind of caught the regime off guard, and that response, by just trying to ignore the news, simply wasn't going to fly.
Since the beginning of the protest on February 22nd, journalists and media had very formal, guidelines not to cover the protest, and they didn't at the beginning. Algerian TV were having, several TV shows, cartoons, and documentaries, and there was no coverage whatsoever about what was going on in the Algerian street. When I marched with the students in the University of Ben Aknoun in Algiers on February 26, one of the slogans were "Ya Sahafa win kunti al-barah," which means you media, where did you go?
It was very significant that on the evening that Bouteflika returned to Algiers, the main national TV channel opted for this very unusual format of an open debate between couple of fairly major, well-known Algerian figures on the current political crisis within the country.
السلطة القائمة فاقدة المصداقية. هذا المشكل الكبير دوكا.
And they evoked openly, the question of crisis, the question of a transition. It was taken by a lot of Algerians as a sign that things were moving from only a few days before, when they'd been trying not to talk about the protests at all.
Every war results in casualties, and the battle for truth in Algeria has produced a few. MEROUANE LOUNNAS spent 12 years hosting a program on a state-owned radio channel, RAI. His show was cancelled this past week because he did not choose his words carefully enough. And LOUNNAS did not even speak directly on the protests or the politics. His crime was speaking philosophically, allegorically.
The subject of this episode was the theory of social contract. The philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau says that people are the source of power, and that a nation cannot be built without its people. I concentrated on this philosophical point. The director of the channel thought I was talking about the current movement, even though I didn't directly refer to it or take any particular political stance. Certain people in public media do not understand the transformation happening in Algerian society today and still behave with a controlling mentality, a mentality that is outdated. The people-led demonstrations have proven that this mentality belongs in the past.
Our interview with LOUNNAS was conducted over Skype because Al Jazeera has effectively been banned from Algeria since 2004. The Bouteflika government is very selective about which international news outlets it will allow in, limiting some to visits by foreign leaders or other stories the authorities want covered. And the on-the-ground absence of global news organizations may have contributed to some of the misconceptions swirling around this story, starting with the lazy labeling of the protests as Algeria's version of the Arab Spring, given that they're describing a population that rose up against one-party rule in 1988, more than 2 decades before their neighbors did.
Look, we respect what happened in other countries, but we are in another concept. We started our revolution in 1988. We had our first free election in 1991, when the Arab world was really in a totally different situation.
Algeria had a free press, vibrant democracy, free speech, a renaissance and bubbling of creativities in the arts and the culture. All of that ended when the elections got cancelled and when the Islamists won, and the bloody civil war that ensued after.
So now people don't even like the term Arab Spring. They just say this is our liberation movement, which is continuing, with all due respect to what happened in other countries.
Algeria was a precursor in the Arab Spring, and this is why Algerians do not like the analogy, because of what happened after the Arab Spring in the region: terrorism, jihadism, Daesh, terrible socio-economic situation, and they don't want that for their country. Algerians feel that they paid a hefty price after their Algerian Spring in 1988 and what followed.
Having been through such an uprising before, having then watched their neighbors do the same, Algerians have fewer illusions than most. They know what has not changed, that President Bouteflika, while out of sight, is still in the picture, that the powers that be, known as le pouvoir, who have backed the president for so long, are still there. Algerians also know that their news media, which are showing signs of life, could revert to old habits at any time.